sorry, that I've titled Charting the Future, Digital Technologies and the Transition of South Africa's Education System. So the content of my presentation is as follows. I will be giving you a bit of an introduction, giving you some context, as well as the aim of the study, why I decided to embark on this study. And then I will give you the theoretical framework that I have used, because this is more of a conceptual paper to conceptualize the transition of the education system. And therefore, I use a powerful theoretical framework, the multi-level perspective, from which I draw my research questions. And then I'll give you the methodology, and then afterwards some findings based on the research questions that I've asked, and also the conceptual framework that I've come up with thereafter. So in terms of the context, we are all aware that there's a shift taking place, transition taking place in the education system. And this is mainly due to the integration of technologies that we are seeing lately. One of the shifts that we're seeing is online learning, right? And that is basically an alternative to traditional classrooms. And this is empowering us as educators to deliver curriculum content remotely, and also assisting our students in the same way. Now, when it comes to online learning, we do have tools that we're using, but as you look through the literature, you find that the literature actually favors ICT as the primary technology. And while ICT has its benefits, the implementation thereof often emphasizes the technological features at the expense of addressing fundamental educational requirements. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the focus tends to lean more towards delivering the content, right? Rather than encouraging student engagement, active learning, as well as knowledge retention. And we were put in this spot because of what actually took place with COVID-19. There was no time to look for a proper tool to teach. We just had to find tools to be able to deliver content. And now that we have moved away and time has passed, and we are able to start thinking about, those kind of tools that are able to assist us to engage our students, to encourage the engagement, the active learning, as well as knowledge retention. I would like to submit to you technologies or digital technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, which include technologies such as the metaverse, holographic technology, virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, and so on. And I will discuss this later on. However, I wanted us to come back to the main aim of this study, which is basically to understand the transition of South Africa's education system due to the disruption of these emerging digital technologies. So what I wanted to do was to develop a conceptual framework of how this transition actually looks like. So there are technologies that have come through, but how now does the education system transition? And therefore, I use transition theories. And one of the most powerful, in my opinion, since I started in academia, is the multi-level perspective framework, which basically analyzes transitions and fundamental changes of socio-technical systems, such as the education system. When we think about socio-technical systems, we can think about the transport system, for instance. It's a system that provides a societal function. For instance, the transport, as I've said, the energy system, the education system is one of those socio-technical systems, and therefore we use the multi-level perspective. It's powerful in the sense that it looks at a transition holistically from 3 levels. The first level being the landscape level. So that is basically where developments like wars, like pandemics, like COVID-19, climate change, that's where all those factors actually sit. So these are factors that are outside of the influence of actors. For instance, as I said, wars and the pandemic. The second level is the regime level, which is where the socio-technical system sits. So basically, in our case, this is where the education system sits. And this is where, it's a system that consists of actors, It consists of rules and regulations. It consists of technologies and how all of these actually work together to define the way we do things at the moment, and therefore the education system as it is currently. And then, I forgot to put it.
Yeah, don't worry, it's a lot.
And then you have the niche level, which is where all these technologies actually sit. So it's like a protected space where experimentation actually takes place, where new technologies actually comes up in terms of their practices as well as their policies. Now, what this is basically saying is that when the socio-technical system is sitting at the regime level, there are landscape issues that start destabilizing the regime, because these regimes exist in the same way for hundreds of years, sometimes 50 years, 100 years, they sit and function in that particular manner for that long. So you need something as powerful from the landscape level to start destabilizing that kind of system. And in its destabilization, you start seeing niche technologies that are starting to move into the regime and transitioning the system into a new system. And so I asked my research questions on all three levels. The first research question is on the regime level that says, now, who are the current actors? What are the current technologies? What are the current regulations that are existing in the South African education system? And with this, I'm trying to answer, what does the education system in South Africa actually looks like right now as the regime, right? And now the second research question I'm asking is questions around the landscape level. Which landscape developments and external factors are applying pressure on this regime now, on the current South African education regime, contributing to its destabilization, because we know these have started taking place, and that's why we start seeing this transition towards online education. The third research question has to do with the niche level. So now that this destabilization is taking place, what are these technologies that are present at the niche level that are challenging or entering, wanting to diffuse into the mainstream to cause this transition of the education system? And so I went on a journey with my research questions, and this is basically what my methodology is. So it's somewhat of a systematic literature review, not fully so, but a level of it, where I identified my records using databases such as Web of Science, Scopus, Google Scholar, and I used the time frame between 2020 and 2024 because I wanted a new information or newish information. That's the search terms that I used. I used education. I wanted to understand or collect papers that were talking about emerging technologies, digital technologies, the metaverse, virtual reality, and holography, and particularly in South Africa, because that's the context that I am trying to study. And with these papers that I found, I assessed the quality thereof using Brooks' method, and I used the weight of evidence because that's what they use in law to weigh, evidence, and therefore I thought it was appropriate for what I was trying to do. And I selected my final papers, which were about 15 in number, and then I went through analysis with Atlas TI and did mathematic analysis to find my themes. Now, the findings, my research question one, remember it had to do with the regime level. Who are the current actors? What are the technologies? What are the regulations in South Africa as it currently sits? And therefore, what I'm finding was that in terms of the actors, it becomes quite obvious that schools, whether public or private, in primary or secondary schools, are part of the key actors. Higher education institutions, public or private universities, are TVETs and so on, individuals such as teachers, students, communities. And what is important in our context, in the South African context, is the two departments that are serving on a governmental level. The Department of Basic Education, and that basically manages the primary and secondary school, and then the Department of Higher Education that basically just looks at higher education, and they are tasked with overseeing tertiary education as well as TVETs. And the role thereof is obviously overseeing policy, funding, addressing educational matters. Now, there are many other actors, but these are key in our education system in South Africa. In terms of regulations, we know that the education system is highly regulated. However, I was looking for regulations that specifically talk to technology in the education system. And in our case, we have the National Plan for Higher Education, as well as the white paper for post-school education and training. And those are a range of policies that basically look at leveraging ICT to enhance various aspects of the sector. And in terms of the current technologies that are in the education space, we know that there are various modalities, face-to-face, e-learning, hybrid, that is the same in our context as well. However, focusing on the e-learning modality, we see that South Africa exclusively relies on ICT, and that's where we start getting these problems such as student engagement. So ICT, I mean your computers, your tablets, learning platforms, video conferencing, and so on. In South Africa as well, we use television and radio, especially for primary and secondary schools. And then in terms of tertiary, these are the technologies that we use, your LMS, especially your Moodles and Blackboard. So you start understanding the education system in South Africa by that first research question. Now, the second research question says, okay, so there's the regime, there's the current education system. What developments or external factors are applying pressure on this current South African regime, contributing to its destabilization? And what we find and what we know is that COVID-19 actually was a catalyst, right? In terms of, for the widespread adoption of digital technologies. But what we're also seeing in the South African context, and perhaps in many other countries as well, is that there's a growing demand for education. For instance, in 2020, my university received 200,000 applications just for first-year students, right? And we could only accommodate 10,000 of them. In 2024, Wits had the same problem. First-year students, 140,000 applications, and they could only accommodate 6,000 of them. So what happens to the rest? Right? So we have to now start addressing, you can see that this highlights the issue of e-learning, because we're running out of physical classrooms, we're running out of physical space, and we have to meet this demand because we have to take care of those who were not able to get into higher education. So you see that is one of the factors that are contributing to the stabilization of the current regime as it sits. E-learning modalities is not without its challenges, and this is what I'm basically saying, that the literature literally highlights students' lack of engagement. We've seen earlier on some presentations that talked to the lack of engagement and social interaction on online learning. It lacks real-time face-to-face interaction. So it has its own challenges, and all of these further contribute to the destabilization of the current educational socio-technical system. So now we start seeing that it creates opportunities from the niche level for niche technologies to gain prominence in the mainstream. And that brings me to my third research questions. Now, what are these technologies that are sitting at this niche level that can help us with student engagement and all these troubles that we are seeing? The first one I'd like to propose is the metaverse, which is a term that describes a shared online virtual space where users, they appear as avatars, can interact with computer-generated virtual environments, as well as with other students in real time. So this increases their engagement. So this can be used in exams, for instance, right? You want to simulate real-world scenarios where students can practice their skills. One of the exams that I set for my students, for instance, in one of my courses was that they had to imagine that they are at a national AI summit, which actually took place at our university, right? Which I participated in. I had to prepare a paper and present it in front of ministers. And therefore, I had to put them in a real world situation. And they couldn't imagine this thing taking place. And in my mind, I thought it's time we start using these technologies so that I can literally create the National AI Summit and they can write their exam or start presenting or preparing their reports in that manner. So it increases that immersiveness in terms of writing their exams. Virtual and augmented reality, we're starting to see this come in many of our training centers, right? So this envelopes the user in a fully artificial virtual environment, that's VR, while AR, augmented reality, is more of a digital overlay over the real world, right? But this is different from the metaverse in the sense that you don't have interactions with your fellow users, you're just interacting with the virtual world. So this we're starting to see being used a lot in training, in medicine, in many of these sectors. And research actually suggests that there's a correlation between learning effectiveness as well as the degree of immersion. So the more the student is immersed, the more that they're able to learn. So we have to start thinking about bringing some of these into our classroom. Now, this one is very interesting to me, which is some sort of holographic technology, right? So you can see the guy who's sitting there in what looks like a box. He's actually in another location, and this box is with these people here, and he's presenting to them, right? So rather than your standard video calls where people appear as flat images, we have now these holographic technologies which provide a sense of physical presence. So it makes it looks like the person is there. And what we can do in education with this is incredible. Because for instance, I start thinking about my daughter who's 5 and she's learning coding at the private school that I've sent her. Right now, when you think about her and another child, another 5-year-old in a rural environment who's not getting that same education, it becomes quite painful to think about. If you have a box like this, with a teacher sitting at that private school, but you have this box at a rural school, then you start having interactions or these kids in the rural areas starting to learn these things that are being learned at private schools. So you're increasing access. Fine, there are challenges in terms of digital infrastructure and all of those things, but I think we can work around that. We just have to think about now how we get this education to people who are underprivileged. So a simultaneous teaching across multiple schools, and you can teach wherever you are. So holographic technology provides a dynamic and interactive learning experience, and then it also increases engagement with the students that a traditional method cannot. So you start seeing that there are technologies that the fourth industrial revolution has brought that can actually assist us in terms of student engagement. However, as per with technology, there are challenges with diffusion into the mainstream. And these are some of the challenges in our context, the South African context, that can hinder the diffusion of these technologies. One, digital infrastructure. We really do struggle with reliable internet. We really do struggle with affordable and access to internet, especially for students in low-income areas. But it means that we just have to start investing more in our digital infrastructure to be able to sort out these kind of problems. Privacy and data security concerns, every country struggles with this, and therefore it's not that we have to start now inputting into our policies. Digital skills that are required to engage this fourth industrial revolution technologies. At the current moment, we're still struggling with skills for technologies in the third industrial revolution, and therefore we know that it's something that we need to work a lot on. And then hardware and software requirements. And that's also a challenge because these things are quite expensive, and therefore you want to be able to provide subsidies basically from government or even from a private sector to be able to afford these so that we don't exclude anyone. The other challenge, the last challenge I would like to talk about is the students' use of these technologies. We must understand that because they're so immersive, they start causing stuff like nausea and addiction and reduced physical connection and so on. But those are things that we can work around because it does not cost that for everyone. So once we overcome all of these diffusion challenges for these technologies that sit at the niche level, then we're able to start seeing an education system that is transforming, one where students are highly engaged because we are adopting technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. So after saying all of that, after studying all of that, this is the conceptual model that I am proposing, right? So on the left, on the vertical y-axis, you see the three levels that I've just discussed with you, which is the landscape level, the regime level, as well as the niche level. On the x-axis, it's time. For any technology to diffuse into a regime or socio-technical system that's sitting at the regime, it takes time. I mean, we start seeing with AI, for instance, that is a technology that has been in existence since 1956 or 1950. But because of time, it sits on this niche level. And there's nurturing taking place. There's all of these things that are taking place before it can diffuse into the mainstream. So what I'm saying here is that the x-axis is time, where there's the emergence of those technologies. Then after some time, you start seeing the diffusion of those technologies, and lastly, the reconfiguration or the transition of the system that is actually entering. So let's discuss this a bit, just for a bit. On the emergence of educational and digital technologies, let's look at the landscape levels. We've discussed this. We've seen that there was COVID-19 that started changing or adding pressure to the regime, limitations of physical classroom space, lack of student engagement, lack of social interaction, and all of those factors are starting to put pressure on the socio-technical system that is the education system. But when you look at the regime itself, we've discussed the actors, the technologies, the institutions, that is the regulations that are taking place currently. But while all of that is happening, the technologies that are able to assist us are sitting there on the niche, at the niche level. When we start now moving along the x-axis, you start seeing the diffusion of these technologies because the landscape developments are adding pressure and destabilizing that regime. But as we discussed, there are challenges that need to be overcome for this diffusion to take place. But once we overcome this diffusion, then you start seeing a reconfiguration of the education system. And you know, as I was saying, the South African education system, you start seeing new actors now. So now we've discussed the actors that are currently in existence, but now we're starting to see technology developers, not even just from the private sector, but even from academia, we start seeing technology developers, sellers, so they start forming part of the actors in the new system. The technology, we're not just no longer just looking at ICT. These technologies, the metaverse, VR, holographic technologies have entered the system. So the education system, in terms of this technology, is starting to look new. And in terms of the regulations, we know that we do need regulations, what we need to regulate so that we don't stifle innovation in this area, so that this education system can start looking new, you know, or merging them with what's already existing. So that's an area that we need to still work on. So this is a conceptual model that I will be testing to get empirical data, but this is as far as I got in terms of my conceptual framework. I have no more time before they give me a 1 minute warning.
Not much time as you want, since there is a presentation that we entitled the end. You have the full time of the board. So please.
No, I'm finished.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. Presentation.